Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump's attack on the independence of the Fed via trumped-up charges his private law firm, the Department of Justice, have manufactured against Chairman Jerome Powell in an effort to lower interest rates to help Republicans in the midterms. Joining us is Robert Hockett, the Edward Cornell Professor of Law and Finance and a Professor of Public Policy at Cornell University, who has first-hand experience working at the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and continues to consult for a number of U.S. federal, state, and local legislators and regulators. He drafted Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal resolution for the House of Representatives and officially advises her on economic policy. His latest books are Money from Nothing, or Why We Should Stop Worrying About Debt and Learn to Love the Federal Reserve, Financing the Green New Deal, A Plan of Action and Renewal, and most recently, Spread the Fed, Distributed Central Banking for Productive Monetary Policy. Then, with a complete blackout on news emerging from Iran as anti-government demonstrations grow and repression intensifies, we'll look into a clash between the other Gulf regional powers, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Joining us is Dr. Annelle Sheline, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She has worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen, and she served as a foreign affairs officer at the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor until resigning over then-President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. She has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Is the Saudi-UAE Rivalry Heading for More Violence? Then finally we'll speak with David Daley, the author of Anti-Democratic, Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Eft, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kick-starting the national movement to reform redistricting. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and we'll discuss Trump's assault on American election systems across many fronts as he gears up to do whatever it takes to ensure the Democrats do not take the House and Senate in November. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Robert Hockett, the Edward Cornell Professor of Law and Finance and a Professor of Public Policy at Cornell University, who has had first-hand experience working at the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Welcome to Background Briefing, Robert Hockett.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be with you again.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Donald Trump has now tasked the Justice Department, which basically is his private law firm, or you could almost call it the Department of Crime, given their disregard for the law. So he's tasked them to go after Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, who's termed out in May. So this is an example of Trump's sort of vicious pettiness. But it's already provoked the ex-Fed chairs, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen, to warn against this outrageous move, saying this has no place in the United States, whose greatest strength is the rule of law, which is at the foundation of our economic success. So, is this another example of Trump's sort of bulldozer just wrecking institutions for whatever reasons? Is this personal? Is there anything beyond what Powell has warned about today in a video clip where he said basically he wants me to lower interest rates? I don't want to do it. It's not the right thing for the economy, and this is why it's happening.
Yeah, I guess my guess would be that it's sort of both things, right? I mean, there's probably a little bit of a personal vendetta element to this, in the sense that, or because Powell has sort of repeatedly bucked Trump's attempts to coerce him, to bully him, to force him into doing things. And if you kind of get away with that, but standing up to Trump multiple times in a row, it's bound, I suppose, to leave a certain taste for vindictiveness. On the one hand, there's also, of course, the fact that Powell quite overtly contradicted and disagreed with Trump while in his presence, right, during that funny little sort of hard hat tour of the new the Fed construction work on the Fed building this past summer, right, where Trump was repeatedly making misstatements about the project and about the cost and about what the project entails, and in every case, Powell would correct him, not in a kind of nasty or snarky way, but just in that very Powell-esque sort of way, sort of straightforward, matter of fact, which of course did a much better job of making Trump look foolish than Snark would have done, I think. So there probably is some vindictiveness at work here. But more broadly, I think my guess would be that what Trump is hoping to do here is to make whoever the next Fed chair is feel all the more frightened, right? To sort of make the person feel terrorized in advance, right? Before the person even takes office, by sort of showing that he's willing to bring the considerable resources and danger that comes with the activities of the Department of Justice to bear against those who, like Powell, sort of stand up to him and don't sort of toe that line. So, ironically, this is on the one hand a matter of Fed independence, but it's also, of course, become a matter of DOJ independence. Jean Pirro is hardly what one would refer to as a reputable lawyer, let alone a reputable U.S. attorney. And she's the one who's opened the investigation, which we should make clear is not going to go anywhere. It has absolutely no legal merit. It won't go anywhere in the courts. But I think what Trump is hoping is that, by the nuisance value of something like this and the kind of reputational valence that comes with a DOJ investigation, that he'll sort of scare any successor to Powell into, making sure to avoid any kind of defiance.
And it's about that little clash that took place at the construction site of the new Fed building, and it's about his testimony, right? Powell's testimony before the Senate about the cost overruns.
Yeah.
That's the fig leaf, right? That Trump's using. I mean, this is a tactic, by the way, that he borrowed from Putin. Putin went after Navalny over some ridiculous financial matter that was made up. It's very similar to what they do with their political enemies, like Letitia James in New York, the AG. They go after her on mortgage fraud when there's no basis, but at least they can throw something out there and see what sticks. This is what's happening, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the tactic. This is, as you said, he's borrowed it from other dictators or authoritarian leaders' playbooks. It simply makes a mockery of the legal process and of, the criminal law process in particular. And of course, that is bound to have sort of long-term deleterious effects on the criminal law, on the criminal legal process, as well, of course, as sort of executive branch integrity going forward and the rule of law going forward. As you said, Ian, there's simply not a question here that this is pretextual. It just is, right? There's simply no doubt about that. Nobody raised any concerns about the testimony before the Senate. And indeed, if there had been concerns of that sort, the Senate itself would have investigated. It's not really for, the executive branch simply to, spontaneously on its own have a TV lawyer uh, announce an investigation of a sitting Fed chair for testimony in Congress when the Congress itself has been entirely happy and content with the testimony. And in that connection, by the way, it's perhaps worth noting that Senator Tillis from North Carolina, a Republican on the banking committee, has said that, this is such an overreach, this is such a travesty and such a misuse of presidential authority that he will simply oppose, just as a matter of course now, anybody who Trump now nominates for the Fed, precisely because Trump has sort of lost all credibility as somebody who can responsibly play any role in determining the membership or the policies of the Fed, including now the exercise of what would normally be his delegated authority to make that kind of choice. Tillis is simply not even going to recognize Trump's authority to nominate a Fed chair at this point because Trump has so abused his role, right, as the chief executive of the nation in connection with the Fed, and not to mention in connection with all manner of other things.
So, Robert Hockett, what can you tell us about the appointees that Trump has made to the federal board?
Yeah, so far, I mean, they're kind of what you would have expected. I mean, they seem to be, perfectly happy and willing to sort of toe the line of Trump when it comes to interest rate policy. The last couple of decisions made by the Open Market Committee when it comes to interest rates have been notably non-unanimous. That's somewhat unusual, right? I mean, there have been cases where these decisions have not been unanimous in the past, but now they're non-unanimous as a matter of course, with the Trump appointees, of course, towing the Trump line or sort of demanding what Trump himself has demanded. There's also, of course, the unusual situation that Steve Mirren, who's one of those appointees, has another role in the administration and in consequence is being billed for the time being as a temporary Fed appointment, who has then, kind of recused himself from his other role in the administration, pending, the appointment of a more permanent holder of that position. So, in that sense, he's doing something kind of similar here with the Fed as what he did with Mulvaney. You'll recall back during his first term, who was both chief White House. What was he, chief of staff on the one hand and appointed head of the CFPB on the other hand. This kind of dual role thing. I suppose now Marco Rubio will be the new president of Cuba or Venezuela or both as well. So this is another, interesting bit in his playbook where he basically appoints officials that he favors to multiple roles.
But what the former Fed chairs are warning us about when talking about this is all pretextual, as you say, that all you have to do is look at what happened in Turkey, where the dictator Erdogan has ruined the economy by imposing his ridiculous economic dogma on their equivalent of the Federal Reserve. And we already know what Trump has done, how he's wrecked the economy because of his obsession with tariffs, which I think have more to do with his ability to shake people down. I think that's isn't that what we really have here? Going back to Putin, you have this dictatorship that's about one man's whims and his power, but most of all about his self-enrichment. I mean, Putin's supposedly the richest man in the world, having shaken down every institution in Russia. And it seems like Trump is doing the same thing. I don't know whether he's going to be able to shake down money out of the Fed. I'm not sure that that's possible. But what do you think is this idea about is it all as simple as apparently it appears on the surface, that he just wants the Fed to lower interest rates so things look better for him in terms of the Republicans holding on the House in November?
I can imagine a number of sort of ulterior motives or a number of objectives that he might have in mind, some of which are more political and others of which are more a matter of personal enrichment, as you suggested also, Ian. On the personal enrichment side, there are a couple of things, right, that one could imagine. One is that, if Trump kind of has an inside line on what the Fed's decisions are going to be when it comes to interest rates, because he himself has, a number of decisive appointees on the Fed board, including a new Fed chair, then he can, of course, tip off his friends in advance about what those Fed decisions are going to be. And they can, of course, then place their bets accordingly, right? Because the markets are typically moved by those decisions. So if you know what they're going to be, then you can, of course, place your bets accordingly. And then when the markets move, in keeping with what you've bet that they will do, you, of course, pocket a pretty penny. And if he's doing this for his friends and cronies, some of whom might indeed then, pay him back in one way or another, or maybe they'll give him a cut, that would certainly be a personal motive. There could also, of course, be a political motive along the lines that you suggested, right? Typically, a party does well in elections if the economy is perceived to be booming. And typically, if you lower interest rates at the right time, in the right sort of time frame before the election itself, in effect, you can kind of goose the economy into sort of, appearing to be prospering or appearing to go great guns in a way that then, kind of propagates good, warm feelings about where things are going and hence about the party that's in power. So he might well be thinking along those lines as well. There is, however, an irony in this particular case, because as you know, the markets took quite a hit when the announcement came out about this spurious investigation into Powell. This is one of these cases where literally it seems nobody, certainly nobody who's regarded as having any expertise, thinks this is good news. You've got Republicans and Democrats alike. You've got people who are typically skeptical of, even hateful of the central bank or the Fed or Powell, who, like notably Peter Schiff, who are sort of weighing in favor of Powell, right? Because even they are sort of looking at this as a bridge too far. In that connection, it might be worth noting that even if you oppose central bank independence, and some people do, and there are good arguments for at least tempering central bank independence, even if you're one of those people, I'm not one of them, but even if you were, you would still, if you believe in the rule of law, hold that, well, that's for Congress to do, right? The Federal Reserve Act is a congressional enactment. And if you want to sort of, kind of trim the sails, so to speak, of Fed independence and allow politics more role in Fed decision making, that would be something for Congress to do by legislation. That's not something for the White House to do. And it's certainly not for the White House to do by trumping up charges, right, by abusing process. And so, I'm once again, thrown back on my frequent observation that the Biden administration really should have thrown Trump in jail back in 2021. They should have vigorously prosecuted all of his crimes, sort of after losing the election in 2020 and many crimes that he committed while in office in his first term. They should have had him in jail. It should not have been Merrick Garland playing Casper Milquetoast. And we're now, sort of seeing the consequences of that. We knew he was lawless. Now he's, of course, being lawless with a vengeance.
And of course, he's already gone after Cook on the board, right, of the Fed. And next week, the Supreme Court will hear Trump v. Cook. And this is again trumped up pretext where he's gone after her over some specious issue involving mortgage fraud, which seems to be the tool. There's this crazy guy that they found inside the government that comes up with all of these suspicious attacks. So I don't know whether the Supreme Court, they should, if they have any semblance of judicial independence, should throw this thing out, why they even took it up in the first place. But what do you think's going on there with Trump versus Cook?
Yeah, so three quick things to say there. First off, you'll remember that we talked about that at the time that he trumped up those charges against Cook, and I said then that they were clearly pretextual, entirely pretextual. And I predicted that the courts would view them as such, and furthermore would allow her to continue in office while the case was sort of pending. In other words, they wouldn't allow Trump to sort of keep her off the Fed. And I predicted that she would stay on there and continue to exercise her decision-making role, and that has indeed continued. That's what she's doing even now. Second, this crazy guy you mentioned in the government who they're using to kind of find these pretextual charges to be brought, This is this guy, Bill Pulte, over at FHFA. Ironically, but unsurprisingly, turns out he himself was doing literally the very same things that he was calling mortgage fraud in the case of Adam Schiff and Lisa Cook and Letitia James. So if they're serious about this as fraudulent, then the crazy guy who's, sort of finger pointing at these people should himself be on the chopping block and should himself be under indictment. But of course, he's not. Finally, thirdly, all of the handicapping when it comes to what the Supreme Court will decide next week is that, to the effect that the Supreme Court is going to find in favor of Cook, that they are going to say that, look, sure, Trump does indeed enjoy greater authority over most regulatory agencies than has been traditional to recognize over the last 70 years or so, which in my view is a problematic thing. But at least they're saying, but the Fed really is different. The Fed is not just any old regulator. It's much more like a kind of Supreme Court of monetary policy, and therefore a Supreme Court of finance and of the economy as a whole. So it really is different, and it does enjoy a certain kind of independence, precisely because idiotic and erratic moves of the kind that Trump tends to make can indeed be calamitous if they are erratic moves with respect to monetary policy. I always tell my students in my finance regulation classes that it's noteworthy that there's only one realm of activity outside of nuclear power where we use the term meltdown, and that, of course, is finance, right? And that, I think, registers our recognition that, there's a kind of existential significance to the kind of catastrophe that can be caused by mucking around with the Fed in erratic ways. You're really talking about 1929 or 2008 type stuff happening here. And, that kind of thing has happened in the past, even with people much more level-headed and much more, compos mentis and sane than Trump is. So just imagine Trump having a free reign in this particular realm. It would be like, putting him in charge of a nuclear reactor. I mean, it's just, you don't want children playing with matches. You don't want Trump playing with monetary policy.
Well, Robert Hockett, I thank you very much for joining us. And just I want to note in the end here, of course, that Lisa Cook on the Fed that Trump's targeted is a black woman.
Yes.
And I've been speaking with Robert Hockett, who is the Edward Cornell Professor of Law and Finance and a Professor of Public Policy at Cornell University, who has first-hand experience working at the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He continues to consult for a number of U.S. federal, state, and local legislators and regulators, and he drafted Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal resolution for the House of Representatives and officially advises her on economic policy. His latest books are Money from Nothing, or Why We Should Stop Worrying About Debt and Learn to Love the Federal Reserve, Financing the Green New Deal, A Plan of Action and Renewal, and most recently Spread the Fed, Distributed Central Banking for Productive Monetary Policy. We're going to take a brief station break, and with a complete blackout of news emerging from Iran, we'll look into a clash between other Gulf regional powers, Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Inflation getting higher. Makes it hard on the buyer. Unemployment on the rise. Gasoline issue filled with lines. Rent being paid late. Please let the dollar circulate. Let the dollar circulate.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Dr. Annelle Sheline, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She has worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen. She served as a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, until resigning over then-President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. And she has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Is the Saudi-UAE Rivalry Heading for More Violence? Welcome to Background Briefing, Annelle Sheline.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in the Gulf region, of course, there's enormous amount of violence going on in Iran, except there's a media blackout, and it's hard to know what's going on there. Your colleague at Responsible Statecraft, Trita Parsi, is saying that as Tehran cracks down, Trump's likely instincts are to stay out. Obviously, I want to talk to you about the other regional powers in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and UAE, and the clashes that they've been involved in Yemen. But let's touch on what is happening in Iran as much as we can figure out. It would seem that the demonstrations against the regime are growing, but so are the crackdowns and repression that seems to be a reflex of this incredibly unpopular government intensifying.
Certainly. I mean, it's obviously, as you said, it's really hard to get a clear sense of what exactly is happening. Clearly, the government is trying to prevent information from getting out and also information from being shared internally. Um, I I hope that Trita, my colleague here at the Quincy Institute, is correct that Trump won't be inclined to intervene militarily. However, I worry because there has been evidence of the U.S. moving various military installations into position in the region, although at the moment there is not a U.S. aircraft carrier in the region. There's been some speculation that the U.S. is unlikely to do any military action unless an aircraft carrier came back into the Persian Gulf. But still, I mean, in general, I do fear that this administration has taken away the wrong lessons from various interventions that it has conducted. For example, last summer, the attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities that, from Trump's perspective, likely seemed like a win, sort of shutting down the so-called 12-day war. Also, the completely illegal kidnapping of the president of Venezuela. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump's takeaway from this is that seems he can engage in military operations, and thus far has not experienced significant pushback or repercussions as a result. So I wouldn't. I'm alarmed that Trump may consider military intervention to be worthwhile.
But wouldn't U.S. military intervention also involve the Israelis? Because Iran will immediately respond by attacking Israel. So it's pretty likely an assumption that Trump would coordinate an attack on Iran with Israel.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I mean, as we saw last summer, it's possible that the Iranians would respond by hitting U.S. military outposts in the Gulf, whether that's in Qatar, as happened in June, or other U.S. installations in the GCC countries. It's a target-rich environment. And we know that the Gulf countries already are feeling alarmed by the events of last summer, and then in particular by the fact that Israel struck Qatar, the capital of Doha, in September. I was in Saudi Arabia and Qatar in just last month, and that is still very much a topic of conversation and concern, and sort of raising questions about the ongoing value of the so-called U.S. security guarantee if the U.S. would allow Israel to hit a country like Qatar.
So let's talk about the rivalry between the Saudi Arabia and UAE, which is a little surprising given that the MBZ, the head of the UAE, was something of a mentor of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Arabian crown prince, inevitably to be the king once his father, who's already impaired, passes from the scene.
Certainly. So this got a lot of attention just in the final days of 2025 because you saw basically the Saudis and Emiratis had both supported the efforts by groups inside Yemen to oppose the Houthis, the group that controls the capital of United Yemen, Sana'a, as well as the area of Yemen where the majority of Yemenis live. And so it's been sort of a de facto two-state solution in that you have the Houthis controlling the former North Yemen, and then you have these other groups in control of the former South Yemen. And that's where the UAE had backed, in particular, secession groups that are in favor of an independent South Yemen, or what they've called the future state of South Arabia. And so in early December, you saw this group, the Southern Transitional Council, which has significant backing from the UAE, suddenly, in a lightning offensive, established control of significantly more territory than it had previously, including in the two eastern provinces of Yemen, the Hadramaut and Al-Mahra, which is on the border with Oman. And this is where much of Yemen's oil resources are. And this is also a very significant portion of territory that shares a border with Saudi Arabia. And so initially, at the time, there was a question of how was Saudi Arabia going to react. And then you saw the Saudi reaction on December 30th when they bombed an alleged weapons shipment from the UAE to the STC. And then the sort of Saudi-backed militias moved to reestablish control over essentially all of the former South Yemen, just rolling back the territorial gains that the STC had made in early December. And then the most recent developments are that the STC has declared itself, it has disbanded, according to the members of the STC that attended a talk in Riyadh, although those members haven't been heard from otherwise. And so there's certainly a question of to what extent was this a voluntary disbanding? And then you had the head of the STC refuse to join that conference. He did not board the plane, and so fled instead to Somaliland, and then from there to the UAE, to his patrons in Abu Dhabi. So now the STC is essentially split. And there is a question of what does this mean for the Saudi-Emirati relationship? What does this mean for the future of Yemen? At present, it seems that we're not going to see any more imminent violence, but that unfortunately in Yemen, it's always up in the air.
But in terms of Trump's having two of his friends at loggerheads, they both give him money, which of course is apparently how you conduct business with the White House nowadays if you're a foreign government. They've been, particularly the UAE, have really showered Trump with a lot of money via crypto. In exchange, they've gotten the top-of-the-line AI chips, which many fear will end up in the hands of China. So in terms of competition for Trump's avarice, how's that going?
Well, certainly, and don't forget the Qataris too, with the plane, and they know how to keep Trump on their good side. But it is an open question when you have them, the UAE and the Saudis operating at cross purposes. It's been interesting to observe the vitriol, because it's certainly reminiscent of the period when Qatar was subjected to a blockade by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries that started in 2017. And you had just a lot of name calling, and just, Qatar was portrayed as just this sponsor of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And now seeing these once allies, these previous, as you said, MBZ had mentored MBS, they were seen as very close. And now, similarly, this sort of war of words playing out on Twitter and social media and in the op-ed pages of various Gulfi publications, of the Emiratis accusing the Saudis of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, of allowing terrorism to come back in or to reestablish itself in Yemen. Whereas the Saudis are accusing the Emiratis of fomenting destabilization, and also this is relatedly tied to both countries backing different fronts in the horrific violence in Sudan. There's also a question related to Somalia and the breakaway territory of Somaliland that Israel just recognized. So I do think that in terms of how Trump is going to react, historically, the US has been more in favor of stability. And at the moment, it's the Saudis that are looking to support sort of the status quo. You know, if the STC hadn't made this sudden grab for territory in December, this would not, we wouldn't be talking about this now. I think we would have continued to sort of see the ongoing status quo. And this is because Mohammed bin Salman has bet his crown on Vision 2030. He has promised that that vision will deliver, that he will diversify the economy of Saudi Arabia. He will provide jobs to this generation of young Saudis who thus far are still willing to believe him. But, you know, 2030 is much sooner than it used to be. And thus far, I don't think much of what was promised in Vision 2030 has really materialized. So MBS is just desperate for stability and is willing to partner with Islamists, even if, whereas the UAE sees Islamists as a very significant threat to sort of their long-term vision. They're quite opposed to Islamists holding power really anywhere in the region, and they have conducted their foreign policy to reflect that. So to get back to your question about Trump, I suspect that both capitals, both Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, are jockeying for position. We did just see a visit by the Saudi foreign minister just last week. And then we saw the UAE backing down to a certain extent, saying that they were not going to sort of continue to antagonize Saudi Arabia at this point. So, as you said, kind of whichever country has spoken with Trump most recently or given him the latest shiny present is likely to have him on their side. But I think in the longer run, it's going to be also a question of how do other countries react to this. And I do think at present you have a lot of countries in the Gulf that are feeling quite alarmed by the perceived partnership or alliance between Israel and the UAE and their willingness to foment instability to pursue their agendas, whereas other countries and most countries around the world generally prefer to work with existing state structures. They feel threatened by secessionist groups or by other non-state actors. This is what the Gulf countries had accused Iran of for so many years, that they were apoplectic, that Iran was fomenting destabilization by funding militia groups and proxies around the region, and now the UAE is behaving similarly to Iran.
Well, their behavior in Sudan, of course, it's despicable in the sense that they're supporting the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, who come out of the murderous Janjaweed militia. And then on the other side, you have the Sudanese Armed Forces, with the government basically tied to the former government of Omar Bashir. Both of them are pretty disgusting, and their citizens are collateral damage. And there's also money involved, gold involved. So, I mean, this is so cynical what these two Gulf states are doing. It's sort of a plague on both of their houses. Is anybody that's going to stop this, probably the world's most egregious humanitarian catastrophe, which recently eclipsed the world's most egregious humanitarian catastrophe, which was Yemen itself?
Certainly, the situation in Sudan is horrifying and hasn't gotten enough attention. I think what's been interesting is the fact that the UAE, until quite recently, had something of a Teflon reputation, that they continued to have this very positive image. Their soft power was strong, and they've invested heavily in that and sort of cultivating their own image abroad, and especially in the US, for example. However, with the fact that not only the fact that they clearly gave a green light to the STC to try to seize this territory in Yemen and sort of destabilize the situation there, but then in particular with what their support for the RSF and the although it hasn't gotten enough attention, it is certainly I think pretty widely known that the UAE is supporting the RSF and the atrocities they're committing. And so I suspect that the UAE has decided, in particular after they normalized with Israel in the Abraham Accords in 2020, that they assumed they would get something of a carte blanche from Washington, that having taken this step, being the first country in that sort of round of countries to normalize relations with Israel, that they would be allowed to operate as they chose to, and to pursue the agenda that they saw best suited their interests, and that the US wouldn't push back because, as is often the case, that US policy towards the Middle East is really primarily about Israel and what the government of Israel says it wants. Moving forward, it's what another dynamic that's sort of interesting here is this talk about the MOU to Israel, which is ostensibly going to be renegotiated, but then you have even Prime Minister Netanyahu himself saying that he's doesn't want to remain dependent on the United States for the long run. You have even people like Senator Lindsey Graham echoing that talking point of Israel no longer being dependent on security assistance from the US. People like Trump whisperer Laura Loomer saying that several months ago. And so I suspect that the region is considering of how things will look as the United States is ostensibly shifting focus to the Western Hemisphere. I mean, this has been something that several previous presidents have said, although it wasn't to the Western Hemisphere, it was that we needed to focus on China. But regardless, that the Middle East was no longer going to be such an area of focus. And as a result, having Israel in partnership with the UAE, they are acting in a manner that they see aligns with their own agenda, which is to disempower governments that they see as hostile, and also to consolidate strategic territory. So in particular, along the southern coast of Yemen, that's where the UAE had built a network of bases and control over key islands, which is, again, this has really lost control of that, or the STC, which officially no longer exists, is no longer holding those positions.
Well, it looks like we've run out of time, but I mean, at the end of the day, as much as Obama tried to get out of the Middle East and Trump has signaled that he'd like to get out of the Middle East, we keep getting sucked back in. And if there's this situation in Iran is likely to spread into where the US and Israel gets involved, then the hole is dug deeper, and it's at the end of the day, a lot of people die, and there's not much to show for it.
Certainly. I mean, I do hope that I don't believe any of the GCC states see a war with Iran as being in their interest, because they know they will be in the crosshairs, whether it's Iran firing on them or simply the destabilizing effects of a military engagement or a full-scale war in the region. So I hope that to the extent that either MBZ or MBS has Trump's ear, they are advising him against military action or other kinds of involvement, escalation against Iran. But again, I do worry that in the other ear is likely Netanyahu, who is very much would be eager for that outcome.
Well, Dr. Annelle, Sheline, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, as always.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Annelle Sheline, who's a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She's worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen and served as a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor until resigning over then President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. And she has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Is the Saudi-UAE Rivalry Heading for More Violence? We're going to take a brief station break, back discussing Trump's assault on America's election systems across many fronts as he gears up to do whatever it takes to ensure the Democrats do not take the House and Senate in November. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, David Daley, the author of Anti-Democratic, Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Eft, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the national movement to reform redistricting. He is the former editor-in-chief of Salon. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Daley.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, David. And today the Washington Post has an in-depth article. Trump is trying to change how the midterm elections are conducted, and it really explores how Trump is attacking America's voting systems across many fronts, and it's quite alarming. But let's begin with Trump's 2-hour interview with the New York Times over the weekend, where he was asked about the 2020 election when he threatened to use the National Guard to seize voting machines. And Trump said, well, I should have. He also went on to say that he's won 3 times. In other words, he won in 2016, 2020, and 2024. So no changing this guy. But what do you make of this latest threat that he should have seize the voting machines, which is one of the wackiest proposals that the Kraken lady ever came up with?
It is indeed. Listen, I think that Trump in his first term was one of the worst presidents in American history, as we know, as historians have said, but he was still somehow restrained, at least by the contrast to the Trump that we have seen in this term, who is wholly unchecked, does not have anybody around him who will say no to him. And that, I think, is something we ought to be deeply concerned about as we head towards 2026 and 2028 elections. A Trump that behaves as unchecked and unhinged and unbound by any sense of norms or laws or the Constitution, who considers everything to be governed by, as he also said in that interview, his own morality, is a frightful situation for American democracy.
Well, let's start with the biggest assault on the election system, and that is that he's trying to get all of the states to hand over all of their highly classified and very personal election data on every citizen, which is just, not just Social Security numbers. It's just about everything you'd want to know about somebody. And a lot of Republican states have already complied with Pam Bondi's request. So how serious is that?
Very serious. This information, as you say, highly personal, highly private, but also can be used by bad faith actors in ways to knock people off of voting rolls ahead of election day. And you can do so in very targeted, specific, and precise manners. The goal of taking over these lists would be trying to claim that some people on these lists are ineligible to vote. As we all know, voter fraud in this country is just so negligible as to be the tiniest percentage of rounding errors. The Heritage Foundation and Hans von Spakovsky, who have been the leading folks carrying the banner of voter fraud over the last 40 years, they keep a database of all of the proven cases since the early 1980s. There are fewer than 2,000 cases in the Heritage Voter database of fraud. And if you consider the hundreds of billions of votes that have been cast over that period of time, it is, it is beyond question that America's voting system is safe, it is fair, and it is accurate. All of the cases that Donald Trump brought after the 2020 election were dismissed, and they were dismissed even by the handpicked judges, oftentimes, that he put on the bench. If you give these people who have perpetuated these myths and, frankly, these lies about voting, and you give them this information and you allow them to knock people off of the voter rolls because of their last name, because there's multiple names at one address, this opens up the potential for real chicanery, and that would be voter fraud on a level that this country has never seen.
But what Trump is pursuing is a 1-2 punch. He's not just trying to basically stack the decks and rig the 2026 midterm elections. If he loses, he wants, of course, to sow doubts about the elections themselves, which is what he did in 2020, and even go further. So this is what we're afraid of. And at this point, the Republicans only have a 1-seat majority in the House. They're barely hanging on. So the other thing that he could do, which would be if John Roberts does what we expect him to do, which is to strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that would get rid of all of the Black and Latino Democratic legislators in the South. It would take us back to Jim Crow. And then, of course, on top of that, you've got the gerrymandering that's already picked up. Well, we don't know how many seats exactly, but they're trying to get 5 in Texas and Ohio, Missouri, North Carolina, and they're also going to redraw districts in Florida. The Democrats have counted here in California, but that's at best 5 seats. So that's an example of what they're trying to do across many fronts.
Yes, that's right. And there's a lot there. Let me try and unpack some of it. I think you're absolutely correct to say that in an atmosphere as partisan and polarized as this one, and with elections as close as they have been in recent years, that continuing to tell lies about voter fraud does lessen the faith that Americans have in elections, and that is deeply problematic. The Supreme Court is going to decide a really consequential case from Louisiana. This decision could come down at any point in time now. And if it arrives in the next 6 weeks, it could affect the 2026 midterms. This case is called Calais versus Louisiana. And as you say, it's a case involving Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and whether or not race can be used at all in drawing district lines. It has the potential to put as many as 19 districts across the South and Midwest that are currently protected under the Voting Rights Act as majority-minority seats. These are districts currently held by Black Democrats in states such as South Carolina, Missouri, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia. If this case comes down in time, and if the decision is what we imagine, given this court's predilection towards eviscerating the Voting Rights Act, you could certainly see anywhere from 12 to 19 seats redrawn, and essentially a South that is completely erased of any black representation whatsoever. Those seats would, from the new racial gerrymanders, would be added on to the partisan gerrymandering that has been going on since last summer when Donald Trump called Texas and demanded 5 more seats from that congressional delegation. California has countered. So if California and Texas essentially zero each other out, the Republican gerrymanders since then in Missouri, 2 seats in Ohio, a seat in North Carolina, the potential of 3 to 5 seats coming up in Florida, still the chance that Kansas and New Hampshire will go ahead and redraw, could lead to another 10 seats that Republicans have essentially gift wrapped themselves ahead of the midterms. So even though the balance of power in Congress right now is essentially 219, 216, there have been a couple of deaths on the Republican side that have taken it down. But Democrats have to take 3 seats to win the House, except for the fact that partisan and racial gerrymandering could move that number from 3 upwards to, 10, even as many as, 2 dozen if the Supreme Court does its worst.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, I don't want to sow any despair because the Democrats are feeling as if they got a good chance, and they should, because Trump is the worst president in the history of this country, and he's obviously madder and madder than he ever's been, and he's gone from being a chronic pathological narcissist now to being an uncontrolled megalomaniac who's trying to rule the whole world and imitate Putin, and his criminality and his treason are just manifest. So the chances should be good. People are upset about ICE, etc. What can they do to stop this mendacity?
Well, I think it is certainly very important that Democrats are successful in earning back a seat at the table, and prying back one of these chambers in the upcoming midterms. I think it's going to require real focus and real strategy on behalf of Democrats. They are going to have to understand, and sometimes Democrats get distracted and they say, well, we're going to beat Mitch McConnell in Kentucky and we're going to send $100 million to the challenger in Kentucky, or we're going to invest a lot of money in whoever's running against Lauren Boebert because we don't like her. And the number of flippable, winnable seats after all of this gerrymandering, it's a very small number. We're essentially looking at a couple seats in Arizona, a couple seats in Iowa, a couple in Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York, Nebraska. Democrats are going to have to be laser focused on those specific races. And I also think it's really important for Democrats to continue to understand that down ballot races really matter. There are races like Secretary of State, for state Supreme Court in North Carolina. These are races that have national implications for democracy, given the way that those courts and those offices have control over elections and have control over gerrymandered maps. So Republicans have really understood this, that power is built from the ground up. And I think Democrats, as they try to win back a chamber nationally, would be wise to keep in mind how the Republicans did this by really having a laser focus on the local elections that draw up the rules for national elections.
Well, David Daley, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with David Daley, who's the author of Anti-Democratic: Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Effed: Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the national movement to reform redistricting, and he is the former editor-in-chief of Salon. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more life.